Subaltern Design Sites by Group 12.
Subaltern design sites are places or events where the subaltern can meet, create, and form communities. The subaltern are people who are ignored and have no voice because of systematic marginalization by other groups. According to Al-Habib Louais, retracing the concept of the subaltern from Gramsci to Spivak, Historical Developments and New Applications, the term was developed in the early 1930s by Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist who wanted to describe the oppressed who are not given the basic rights of participation from the elite or ruling class in society. The term has since been used in post-colonialism studies. In the 1980s, a group of South Asian scholars called the Subaltern Studies Group or Subaltern Studies Collective was dedicated to unpacking the treatment of peasants in colonial India. The power imbalance created by British colonialism vehemently denied peasants, the common people, from contributing to their own history. The most notable post-colonial works dealing with subaltern groups comes from Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, an activist and professor at Columbia University. Her essay called Can the Subaltern Speak?, published in 1988, navigates the oppression of the subaltern woman in India and the paradox of perceived helplessness from elite groups. She wrote that the subaltern woman is as mute as ever when elite groups attempt to save them from oppression. This is where subaltern sites become so important. According to Andrés Lombana Bermudez, a designer researcher focusing on digital inequalities, subaltern sites allow for productive dialogue within groups. Therefore, the spaces give the subaltern the opportunity to meet with each other, to address their experiences with inequality and oppression on their own terms. Even better, they also provide the opportunity to form a community, to learn, create, and organize together. This lets the subaltern take control and agency back. They are not given a voice by their oppressor or colonizer. They cultivate it and amplify it themselves.
Microsites that help foster innovative technologies in a technology-driven space have always existed. The need for subaltern sites is demonstrated by the barrier of literacy and the ability to have large amounts of written documentation. Ranajit Guha noted this in Selected Subaltern Studies when discussing the post-colonial interpretation of the defense mechanisms that India's subaltern used against their colonizers. Subaltern sites provide safe spaces in which the more marginalized are given the recognition and validation they deserve. Other places, especially hackathons, tend to focus on the achievements of cisgender white heterosexual men. In recent decades, tech conferences and other design developments focusing on marginalized and subaltern groups have popped up in large numbers. Reducing the matrix of domination as well as the divide between privileged and subaltern has been an ongoing effort around the world. Notable movements have occurred in India, Brazil, and in native groups throughout the Americas.
Many researchers have looked deeper into marginalized design practices and have noticed this ongoing pattern. Oppressed communities who create their own design spaces and create their own design practices are pushed away and made to seem less important, while those who are white, cisgender, and predominantly male receive the most respect and validation. According to the book Design Justice, Jose Gomez Marquez, an MIT researcher dedicated to normalizing DIY health technology, discovered that between 1900 and 1947, female nurses designed and modified medical technology to improve patient care and to make it more accessible for everyone, yet this all went largely unrecognized. Going back to the early 1900s, Nurses were taking care of their patients in the comfort of their own home, where they were able to design new practices and technology from common household items. This was seen to be unsophisticated and unworthy, therefore their creativity and knowledge went unrecognized, and because the support wasn't there, their solutions to improve medical technology remained at the site where they were created, or even just as an idea in someone's head. As a result, care that could have been improved wasn't, and patients who could have been helped weren't. Jose Gomez was inspired by this history and continued his work and study by creating the Maker Nurse program, where they are working to gather a community of creative nurses across the United States to help develop good, practical, low-cost ideas. There are also times where subaltern communities purposefully avoid visibility on their practices and modernizations to avoid systematically unequal policies. According to Sasha Costanza-Chock, this is very visible in the US today in the legalization of marijuana, and she states, after decades of a so-called drug war that saw hundreds of thousands of people, disproportionately Black and Latinx, incarcerated for marijuana use, possession, and sales, suddenly white-owned companies are swooping in to capture the lion's share of newly legalized marijuana market. The ACLU, a nonprofit organization dedicated to defend and preserve the individual rights and liberties guaranteed to everyone in this country by the Constitution of Laws of the United States, created a report on the injustices relating to marijuana between Black and white communities. Someone within the Black community is at a much higher risk for incarceration over drug possession than someone within the white community, and statistics show that a Black person is 3.73 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white person is, even though there are similar usage rates amongst both. There has been an ongoing enforcement of marijuana laws primarily targeted to non-white communities, while those who are white have been capitalizing off of it. To eliminate this injustice, the ACLU believes in pushing towards the legalization of marijuana for those over 21 through a system of taxation, licensing, and regulation. Until then, they also recommend that law enforcement agencies and district attorney's offices deprioritize marijuana possession laws.
Subaltern design has existed in the tech and entertainment sectors for many years, but it has often been overlooked. Recent advances towards more inclusion and visibility in video games have been primarily focused towards gender representation, but there is a growing movement that gives representation to minorities. In recent years, more indigenous people in South America have created games that gained traction, thus giving themselves more power. However, Latin America as a whole only represented 4% of the games market in 2017. Within the video game industry, there are two subaltern groups with contrasting methods: those who advocate for openly critical software, and those who advocate for becoming part of the mainstream market. Regardless of the method, many developers have found that they do not need to create edutainment games and can just create a game that features their culture. In the Oklahoma region of South America, local communities were involved in the design process of an information system for children's health. Discussions were facilitated by people who were familiar with the area and who also had an understanding of the norms and values of the society. Arrangements were made to enable people to participate in the design process through the use of local language and having meetings near where they lived or worked. When the system was implemented in 2003, it was successful because it incorporated the culture and lifestyle of the local population in addition to empowering them. Discotech is a movement that promotes collaboration and visibility. Chapter 4 of our textbook defined them as an event that provides one excellent model for how to organize inclusive, community-centric events focused on participatory design, digital media, and technology. Another movement is the Afrofuturist occupation, and it works to raise awareness of the long history of Afro-Brazilian socio-technical innovation. Movements are occurring throughout the world, empowering a multitude of groups and continuing to evolve the subaltern movement. There is growing interest in reimagining design events to be more intentionally liberatory and inclusive.
Unfortunately, the major roadblocks to the improvement of subaltern design sites comes from the many deep-rooted social issues that cannot be overcome without self-determination of this oppressed class, compassion from society at large, and policies altering the fundamental perspectives of the ruling class. In a 2020 article titled, "What if the Subaltern Speaks? Traditional Knowledge Policies in Brazil and India," which compares the experience of subaltern groups across nationalities from both the social movement and post-colonial perspectives. Author Thomas Eimer states, "As the contestations on indigenous self-governance illustrate, the ability to formulate frames also depends on historical legacies that go back to the era of colonization." When citing the relative success of the Brazilian focus group compared to the Indians, Eimer stated that indigenous groups were able to develop a consistent and widely accepted policy frame, which has enabled them to form alliances with other societal actors, but also that historical coincidences, such as the country's relatively recent democratic transition, have facilitated their achievements because they increase the salience of the human rights discourse among a broader public. While Eimer attributes this movement to the mere coincidence of democracy, this does not mean that a similar system could not arise out of focused intention and perseverance. This idea of democracy as a solution is broken down further in the 2016 article Modalities of Injustice in the Subaltern Discourse. In it, author Teresa McClary Jeffries argues that our current conceptualization of democracy in the West is not sufficient to solve these problems, and an empowerment of self-representation must be included, stating, "Therefore, it is imperative that democratic governance becomes participatory, allowing citizen residents self-representation and co-equal decision-making power from inception to implementation. And subaltern self-representation must be the new checks and balances of 21st century participatory democratic governance, and would serve to reconfigure institutional power bases." The access to this representation may come in ways that are not obvious for those of us already situated in the power hierarchy, unable or unwilling to see outside of it. Subaltern self-representation often entails resisting engagement with 21st century modes of technology, industry, and capitalism. It's our duty not only to offer inclusion and representation to better our current system, but also to allow for separate forms of autonomy. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly required for this transformation, is the integrity of the individuals and cooperatives who call themselves truth seekers and provide us with the very information for which we form our conceptualization of large-scale problems like this one. As a 2006 article emphasizing the use of both empirical and anecdotal evidence from the Cultural Anthropology Journal put it, this alternating endorsement of both cultural critique and objective social science may be a necessary concession to the political realities of the world we live in and seek to engage with. It certainly embodies a more accurate reflection of the utterly contradictory struggles of the people with whom we're allied. And more importantly still, it entails a commitment to generating the kinds of knowledge they ask and need us to produce.
This video incorporates the following guidelines to serve individuals with accessible needs: legible text sizes and fonts, high contrasting colors, image captions, video captioning and subtitles, video transcript available, and minimal animations and distracting elements.